Welcome to An Officer and a Gentleman, the podcast where I talk about Officer and a Gentleman 1 minute at a time. I'm your host, Brian. This minute begins with the Paramount logo. Reminds me of those days when I would record those Friday the 13th podcasts with Greg, but he was too cool to join me for this podcast. We open on a beautiful sunlit apartment. A shaggy-haired, wife-beater-wearing Richard Gere enters the frame. He looks so handsome. In the corner of the room, there's what looks like a naval officer's hat. It's unclear at this point if Gere is the officer, the gentleman, or both. He pulls the shades down. A title card tells us that it's Seattle, Washington. He looks over and sees a naked man in bed with two naked women.
And then Jason comes and kills them? All right, we're back with You're All Doomed, the podcast that stalks its way through Friday the 13th, the final chapter, in 13-minute chunks. I'm the Super Bowl of self-abuse, Greg.
And I'm still just Brian.
And this segment starts with the good old Paramount logo and ends with a nurse checking the hospital's Windex inventory.
We get another Paramount logo for the fourth movie in a row. And then that's followed up by yet another recap of everything that's happened in the previous movies. Basically, it's just concentrated around Paul's campfire speech.
But I like this one. It's sort of a highlight reel, and it's brief, for one thing, and it kind of encapsulates all of the best moments from the previous couple of movies. So I really dig this one.
Yeah, we get some cool cameos because it's a little bit more comprehensive. It's not just the one story that Mrs. Voorhees tells or the one story that Paul tells. It's kind of like, here's everything that's happened in those first three movies. And so we get cameos by, young drowning Jason. We see Enos again. We see Crazy Ralph. We see Steve Christie, Alice, and then we see tons of Jason's victims. And we even get to see Jason's subuncle hematoma on his thumbnail.
And it ends with my favorite moment. It blast fades out on Chris from Part 3's line, "You can't be alive."
Yeah, I like that too, because it was very unexpected, because it was a lot of the dialogue that you were hearing was, you could see the characters actually saying the word, but this was more just like a voiceover, and it was like a nice kind of summation of everything that we had just seen. It was like all this stuff had happened, he was dead, and then she's like, "You can't be alive," and then it just kind of like fades out.
Yeah, and it kind of foreshadows his return to life in a few moments. Spoiler alert, but I mean, like, this movie starts with him laying on the ground dead, but that's a nice way to set up that he's apparently very difficult to kill.
And then that montage ends with Jason's axe-damaged hockey mask flying toward us on the black screen, and then you see like the words Friday the 13th, and then I'm giving up even trying to explain why this is happening anymore, but the mask explodes just like it did in part 2, and it reveals that this is the final chapter. This is it. This is the end of Jason Voorhees.
Yeah, the intro was great. The main titles, less so. Aside from the fact that the hockey mask explodes for some reason, like you say, they reused the spear gun effect from Vera's death in part 3 for the swooshing title to come flying through the mask.
Point, yeah.
So it felt a little bit cheap to me, but I did like how the title Friday the 13th fit within Jason's hockey mask. That was cute. The credits, the format of the credits, and the font they use and everything is much more like parts 1 and 2, which departs from the cheesy 3D effect of Friday the 13th part 3. So it's white type on a black background. And there's some really great music by Harry Manfredini, as always, playing while these credits are being shown. We'll get into some of the cast as they appear in the movie, but one of the credits that jumped out at me is that this was the casting director for this movie was Pamela Basker and Fern Champion. It looks like Fern is still working. Pamela appears to have retired or moved on to something else, but either one or both of them did casting for the Police Academy series, the Break-In series, including Electric Boogaloo, Naked Gun 1, Mortal Kombat 1, and Babylon 5. They did a hell of a job with this movie, as we'll get into once we talk about the actors involved. But this was a pretty damn great job by the casting department. And then a familiar face is back in the credits, a familiar name at least. Tom Savini is back. He did the effects and makeup for the first movie, and then was occupied by other things for parts 2 and 3. But they managed to get him back for this. He actually replaced the person that they had originally hired for this, a guy named Greg Canham, who went on to win some Oscars for makeup in movies like Bram Stoker's Dracula, which had some really kick-ass vampire effects, Mrs. Doubtfire, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and then the recent Oscar winner Vice, where he turned Christian Bale into Vice President Dick Cheney. The director of photography, forgive me if I butcher this name, but I believe it's Hayo Fernandez, who would later go on to serve as the cinematographer for Delta Force 2.
Nice.
Operation Stranglehold. Screenplay is by a guy named Barney Cohen, who wrote one episode each of the He-Man series and the Thundercats series that kids from the 80s are probably familiar with. And then director of this movie was Joseph Zito. He's the first guy who was not already directly involved in the series. They brought him aboard almost as like a free agent. He has some pretty cool directing credits with Chuck Norris movies like Missing in Action and Invasion USA. Also directed the Dolph Lundgren masterpiece Red Scorpion. Apparently he's a bit of a perfectionist, which worked more for some people in the cast and crew than others, but he seems like a pretty good dude. And I liked this quote that is attributed to him via Barney Cohen in Peter Brackey's Crystal Lake Memories book. Apparently Joe Zito says, "If you scare someone in a theater, that takes about 3 seconds. But if you creep someone out, that lasts all night." And that's kind of exactly what I like about these movies is, yeah, they have a lot of jump scares, but I think he gets the fact that being spooked and being freaked out is almost better than being startled.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, that's why the jump scares of like a cat jumping through the window tend to just get met with eye rolls rather than actual shrieks of terror. But like sustained creepiness is much more effective.
Credits conclude, and the movie itself immediately picks up with a very Richard Donner-esque helicopter shot, which right there, that shows that this is a bigger budgeted movie than the previous installments have been. It's an overhead helicopter with a searchlight blazing right into the camera, so you can tell that something's already going on. Something's up.
Yeah, it reminded me of that scene in T2 when John Connor comes running in and he's like, "The cops are here." And Linda Hamilton's like, "How many?" And he's like, all of them, I think. Because, I mean, like every single cop and ambulance from, the greater, Tri-County area have showed up to this crime scene.
Including what I think might be Commissioner Gordon from Tim Burton's Batman movie.
We see a bunch of medics taking bodies out of a house, and then we see, even more cops parked outside what we are starting to realize now is a familiar looking barn. And it's clear that we're picking up, I guess, immediately after the events of part 3. But what I don't understand is when we last left the characters of part 3, Chris was being hauled away by the police. And this is just my opinion, but it felt like it was dawn. It was really early in the morning, immediately after the events happened. And then now suddenly it's nighttime. Now, we can presume that they've been there all day cleaning up Jason's mess, but it's a pretty long day because Jason's still lying around.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're getting at, and I agree. I think that the police came and bundled Chris off to the loony bin the morning after her whole ordeal, so it was bright and early. But I mean, I figure by the time they clean up the 7 kids and 3 bikers and mark all of the evidence and really take the scene apart from a forensic standpoint, it would be later in the evening or even possibly the next evening. I don't know how long it takes to deal with that kind of carnage.
Yeah, that's true. We do see 2 police officers picking up an axe lying next to Jason's body and putting it in an evidence bag. But
Which cracked me up.
Right, because the cops aren't wearing any gloves, so they're getting their fingerprints all over the axe handle, and just, like, the bag is like not even 25% of the size of the axe. So I don't know what they're trying to cover with it.
Right, and I want to see that introduced as Exhibit B in the trial. Right. They did this disgusting huge axe with a little tiny plastic bag around the blade. Jason's then loaded into an ambulance marked as Wessex County. As best I can determine, that's fictional, at least in New Jersey. One thing I noticed about the ambulance is that the word ambulance on the front is written frontwards. So I was kind of curious to find out when they began marking ambulances with that word backwards so that you can read it in your rearview mirror. And I wasn't able to find a specific time period where that was introduced. And even to this day, some ambulances do it and some don't. So it's not a consistent thing that's mandated by any sort of governing body that I can determine.
Or maybe they were just operating a small town budget and couldn't afford to put the letters on backwards.
Right. Or like, one guy did it and then realized he should have done it the other way.
Oh, shit, the B is upside down.
As they're loading Jason in, I also catch a shot of some other vehicles, and it looks like Ecto-1 is there. So,
right.
Like, did the Ghostbusters show up?
I'm also not sure why the helicopter is there, because he's basically just arbitrarily shining a spotlight all over the place. He's not shining it on like one particular thing. It's just like flying it around. Like, it's more for cinematic purposes than anything. It's just everywhere. And it's like, I can just imagine the cops on the ground like, Jesus Christ, would you just pick a spot and stick with it? I can't see anything.
It does. Yeah, I agree. It does. It seems a little silly, but it does sort of add a sense of chaos and tension to the scene. So I kind of like that they were able to include it. That's pretty cool.
One thing I noticed before they were putting Jason in the ambulance was that they were like kind of strapping him to the gurney, and his arm slides out and it brushes the legs of one of the female paramedics, and she kind of like freaks out, and you can tell that she's probably a rookie or just not used to seeing this type of carnage before, and everyone else is just kind of very nonchalant about what they're seeing. But she's particularly freaked out by, Jason and just everything that's going on. And, we don't know exactly what's going on in her head, but you can tell she's just not thrilled to be there.
This is the first jump scare of the movie. It's his left hand that flops out, and I noticed that his fingernails are horrifying. They're even worse than they were with the subungual hematoma. The nails are just like almost like claws or talons or something. The ambulance driver reminds me of Rae Dawn Chong from Commando for some reason.
Very much so, yeah.
She was played by an actress named Frankie Hill, who also did some work for the movie War Games, which I think I need to rewatch at some point because I saw that a lot as a kid and I haven't seen it in decades.
Another thing about the helicopter, which I'm obviously obsessed about, was all the cops are running around doing their things, and then all of a sudden, I think it's the helicopter pilot on a loudspeaker is like, "Okay, boys and girls, let's get rolling." And everyone just kind of like packs up their shit and starts to leave. Like he's,
Or was that the first assistant director and it was really like for the crew?
Right. All right. We've seen enough of them walking around in the rain. Let's get this shit on the road.
But overall, I'd say this is a really, really strong first scene. It establishes Jason as a thing to be feared, even in supposed death. And I really like that the camera lingers on Higgins Haven for kind of a long time after everyone is gone.
Yeah, it's our first like really good look at the geography of the location of part 3. Like we start to really get an idea of what the layout was and what this place looked like.
Yeah, and then there's also like a hint of closure for that movie that this little lingering shot kind of imbues, and I really dug it. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, because like all the cars are, it's very crowded at first and there's lots of light because of the stupid helicopter pilot, but then there's the cars start to drive away and it just gets quieter and quieter, and all we get is, you're right, it's like one final establishing shot, and like we see the main house and we see the outhouse that Chuck was taking a shit in, and then we see the barn, and it's just kind of like, remember everything that went down here in that last movie? Well, we're wrapping it up and leaving, but this was like a horrible event that happened here.
The ambulance arrives at the hospital and Jason's gurney is wheeled inside past some people in a waiting area who are grieving. So, I mean, I assume these are families of victims from parts 2 and or 3.
I was wondering that too. And it was the first time that I really noticed it, which is one of the things that I like about dissecting these movies into the smaller chunks, is you start to pay attention to these little details. But it did get me wondering who that family was. And I don't know if I need to know whose family, but I'm just assuming that it had to have been one of the victims from Higgins Haven, the family of one of the victims. So I kind of spent a moment wondering who it could have been, and who were they mourning, and I just thought it was a nice little touch. Of course, it could have just been some random family that was there from a guy that got hit riding his bike, but
sure.
But I like to think it was Jason's doing that made them miserable.
Right, and I wondered even if, because this is really only a couple of days past the events of Friday the 13th Part 2, that it could even be like they might still be processing the bodies of the victims from Part 3. So this could even be like, this could be Scott's family or even like Harold and Edna's friends or something.
Or Paul, because we don't know where the fuck Paul is.
Right.
I guess it's also fair to point out that could also be friends of Jason that are very upset at his demise.
Hey, that's a good point. They were waiting for his body to get there so they could.
they're outside doing one of those newscasts. Like, I've known Jason all my life, and I can't believe he would ever do anything like this. He was, I'd see him outside mowing his lawn, and he'd always wave to me when I drove by, and he was so sweet with the kids.
Run across the road as I was driving down my street.
Yeah, he wore a sack over his head, and then later on he went with the hockey mask. But he was so nice and quiet. He never bothered us, and we're really sad to see him go. As Jason's lying on the gurney, he has the most bizarre profile. His belly looks like I don't know. It's almost like there's an anvil sitting on his stomach or something, and then they put the sheet over it. It's very boxy and angular, and it doesn't really align with what it looked like when they originally pulled the sheet over him and threw him on the gurney. So I don't know what's going on there. If it's a camera trick so that you can't. Like, I don't know, because it's not even his feet. It's not like his feet are propping up the sheets.
Right, or like, does he have his knees arched or something?
Right.
Yeah, it's
He's
very
really
strange.
bloated from lunch.
Yeah, it's a very weird, shrouded silhouette, and it'd be funny to like whisk the sheet off to see what position he's in or something.
He just has a giant beer belly that he's been sucking in the whole time, and now that he's dead, it's just like...
And then we're introduced to Axel, who is apparently the coroner or, the mortician or whatever role he plays with the corpses.
I got to ask something. Axel's also eating the most disgustingly wet sandwich I've ever seen in my life. And I can't imagine what is on this sandwich that's making it so sloppy.
Yeah, and the fact that he just plops it right down on presumably Jason's forehead.
Well, no, it looked like he was putting it on that weird lump that's underneath the sheet. So it's almost like it's a nice little table.
Resting area.
Yeah.
So then, like the oil and juice from this sandwich is going to seep through the sheet. And, clearly Axel has no respect for the dead, but he certainly got quite an appetite.
Well, he definitely has no respect for the dead, because one of the paramedics asks Axel if Jason is his last, quote unquote, patient for the night. And Axel said he's still working on another really cute girl. And the paramedic was like, well, it was, a really cute girl. And Axel goes, well, she still is. All you got to do is go over there. And thankfully, one of the paramedics are like disturbed enough by this that they just cut him off and just don't let him finish the sentence. But it's like, dude, what are you doing in these examination rooms with these corpses?
Well, and as he was saying that, he also winks at Ray Don Chong. So it was just, he was totally like using that as an opportunity to hit on her.
Yeah.
It did not work, clearly. But as they walk away, we see something under the sheet shift slightly, which was a nice detail.
I don't know if I noticed that.
Yeah, it's very subtle, but you notice almost like a little bit of a
like
wiggle.
a shimmy?
Yeah.
Like he's readjusting his nuts or something.
Yeah, maybe that was just Ted White.
That was the lump under the sheets. Yeah, Axel eventually leaves the examination room and ends up walking over to a nurse who I'm pretty sure is Catherine Mary Stewart from The Last Starfighter. But he says that, he's finally free, and there's like this weird kind of flirtatious sort of banter going back and forth, and she tells him that he has a headache. And then she's like, for you, I always have a headache. But Axel just doesn't back down. And he says that he can, he offers a way to like fix the headache and tells her to like meet her in the cold room, which sounds really romantic.
I love that we keep trying to cast Catherine Mary Stewart in these movies. We did the same thing with Part 3. So I feel like if we ever do make a Friday the 13th movie, we need to put Catherine Mary Stewart in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that there's, he's trying to lure her into the cold room, which is, of course, where Jason eventually winds up being stashed, as though the cold room is some great place to lounge around and goof off or, make out.
But she still smiles at the prospect. Like, it's this weird back and forth where he's being totally creepy and she's shooting him down with every, phrase that he's coming up with, but then she's like, or he mentions the cold room and she's like, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
She's giving off a lot of mixed signals, and they have a very weird love-hate dynamic that doesn't quite come off properly. I don't really like either of these people.
So we know her name is Nurse Morgan because of the name tag that she has on her shirt, and she enters the cold room looking for Axel. The room is dark, but there's a little light coming from the TV that's actually playing like a really pervy aerobics video.
Yeah, this is a pretty humorous detail, but it was actually from a real show, a real series called The 20-Minute Workout, which was started in 1983 in Canada and syndicated down here in the United States. But it featured high-impact aerobics followed by a stretching session. There were 2 seasons of this show produced. The first season featured a different instructor each day, but then the second season featured only 2 instructors across all of the episodes. One of the people who was frequently shown on this, and I think even shows up in the segments we're seeing here, is a woman named Bess Mata, who went on to play Ginger in The Terminator.
I think this is all, the videos are also spun off from an original thing called Aerobicize, which came out in 82. And you perverted bastards can buy a used VHS copy of it on Amazon for $49.95.
I'm curious why there's a television in the cold room. That does not seem like the kind of place where you'd kick back and, have a soap opera running while you're supposed to be examining corpses.
Exactly. Yeah, you would only be in there to be doing work on a corpse, and why would you be distracted by a television? But I don't think Axel has shown great discipline in his job, so maybe that's just his choice because he's not exactly paying a lot of attention to his actual job. As Nurse Morgan is standing in the cold room, she stops to look at the video for a second, and she's just kind of rolling her eyes that Axel would be watching something like this at work. But behind her is a body on a gurney covered with a sheet, and we see some very subtle movement underneath the sheet, and it's Axel. He scares the nurse, and she calls him something like the Super Bowl of self-abuse, and I'm not really sure what the Super Bowl of self-abuse would mean. I mean, does it mean that it's like boring and bloated, or it has too many commercial breaks?
Ouch.
Yeah, I don't know, but
yeah, I'm not sure what that's supposed to do to his ego. That's a weird zinger.
Yeah. But, she tells Axel that she just came into the room to watch the news. So again, the cold room also substitutes as some kind of break room as well, because she went in there specifically to watch television. And so the two of them sit down to watch the newscast. But we also notice that Jason's body is right behind them as they're sitting down for this newscast. The newscast is basically just summarizing all the mass slayings that have been going on, and they do describe it as yet another chapter in a story that most residents of Crystal Lake had prayed was over. So it's definitely an ongoing news story in this area, and they're just continuing the coverage of the mangled bodies that they continue to find. And
I love that the graphic they have behind the newscaster, the Crystal Lake Massacre graphic. It looks like it's a sign for a middle school play. It's so ridiculous and hand drawn, and the news anchor, I'm pretty sure it's Dick Sargent. At one point, on the TV news, the newscaster kicks over to Officer Jay Jameson. I wonder if his middle name is Jonah.
And when they're talking to the officer, he basically just confirms that the man responsible for the murders in Wessex County, which I guess is where Camp Crystal Lake is and Crystal Lake is, the man responsible for all those killings at this moment is in the Wessex County Medical Center morgue. So we have confirmation that the media knows that Jason Voorhees is the killer of all these people.
Which Nurse Morgan cheers softly at the mention of their employer, but Axel reaches back and pats Jason, calling him pal.
Yeah, she's oddly thrilled to hear her place of employment mentioned on TV, considering her profession. I don't feel like it's something to be proud of. Like, yay, all those dead bodies that they just picked up, they're here where I work. Isn't that awesome?
Yeah, between that and the mixed signals and annoyed expressions that she keeps giving Axel, I have problems with this young woman. I don't care for either of them.
Yeah, I mean, in her defense, I do kind of get it. You know, my office in Chicago was partially destroyed by that robot worm thing in Transformers Dark of the Moon, and I remember being pretty excited about that when I was sitting in the theater and got to see it on the screen.
Fair enough. But for some reason, the mention of this terrible event and the influx of bodies that they obviously have coming into their place of employment gets them both turned on, because they start to flirt a little more heavily and even start making out.
Yeah, I seriously can't figure these two out. She's, cold 1 second, hot the next, and but I don't know. Maybe Axel likes girls that play hard to get.
So I have a question for you, Brian, and that is, how horny would you have to be to fuck next to a dead body?
That's a rhetorical question, right?
As they continue to make out, we get our second jump scare. It's Jason's other hand. His right hand flops out from under the sheet, so Jason is clearly ambidextrous.
Yeah, when his hand slides out, it kind of like grazes the nurse's ass. And I think it would have been great if Jason had like a little boner tent going on underneath the sheet as like all this is going on next to him.
This obviously startles Nurse Morgan, and she jumps up enraged by Axel's carelessness. She thinks he may have even done it as an intentional prank, and basically zips up her little nurse uniform and storms off to check the inventory of Windex.
Did you happen to notice what Axel said when she freaked out? And, like when they were making out, he jumps up and he goes, "Jesus Christmas, holy Jesus goddamn, holy Jesus jumping Christmas shit." And it sounds like Clark Griswold freaking out in like Christmas Vacation or something. And it was just such a random, semblance of words. I'm like, all right, dude, whatever you want.
Yeah, that's probably some strong improv going on there.
Yeah, so as Greg said, Nurse Morgan kind of just stomps her way into the storage room and starts to take a half-ass inventory of the medical supplies in there, and that's where this minute leaves off.
We don't have any deaths in this episode, but like I said, it's a really great first segment, and it really sets up the horror from the last movie and foreshadows what we'll be facing in the coming moments.
Hopefully that involves more Axel.
I can only hope.
I do want to take a minute to acknowledge the theme song for the podcast. Originally for season 3, we'd reached out to musician Chris Holland about using his song Groovy Goalie, which was kind of a heavy metal cover of the disco theme from part 3. He was kind enough to let us use it for the season 3 podcast. And we had such a great reception from the fans, people saying that they liked it a lot better than the theme we were using for the first 2 seasons, that we reached out to him after season 3 and asked if he'd be willing to let us use it moving forward for the podcast. And he was kind enough to say yes. So we're really thankful for that.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it, man.
And we look forward to having it on future podcasts. So we have a link in our show notes to check out his Bandcamp. He's got a lot of other really great songs, so be sure to check that out. Well, until next episode, I have been Brian.
I've been Greg.
And you are all doomed.